apVerb is a reverb plugin like no other, one that can make a sound like this, sound like this, like this, or even like this. It offers remarkably deep controls over the reverb tail that are still intuitive to use. You'll just need to rethink a bit, because it's nothing like any other reverbs I know. Once again, this video is not sponsored and in no way affiliated. I just think it's a really cool reverb plugin that deserves more attention on YouTube. The dev did answer some of my questions in advance, just so I can make sure I don't explain this wrong, because it's quite unusual. Needless to say, it's especially useful to users of Bitwig, because the stock reverb we get is a bit, yeah. apVerb is a reverb built out of thousands of delays that act pretty independent of each other, and can independently be processed, allowing you unusually detailed control over the reverb tail. The delays are all spaced based on randomly generated velvet noise to create a smooth, resonance-free reverb tail. Velvet noise in essence just means a type of randomly generated noise where a sample is either 1, -1, or 0. apVerb further decorrelates this to make sure repetitions are avoided, which could otherwise create unwanted resonances in the reverb tail. When it comes to shaping our tail, the first page of the reverb presents us with a traditional early and late reflection separation. The early reflections on the left simulate the first few echoes of the wall of a room. You get a density setting, a room size in meters, and an overall level control. On the right, we control our velvet reverb tail, allowing us to set its density for certain parts in the tail and its volume envelope. Like many other parameters, these two can be automated over time, including in ways that wouldn't be possible with ordinary reverb. We can literally just draw the shape of a tail over time with a kind of automation lane. The knob then becomes an offset for the entire envelope. Curves support both breakpoints and bends, with optional snapping to a beat grid when we set our reverb time to note values. As you can tell from the density number, we are dealing with many thousand delay pulses per second here, so you can get some really smooth tails. Variation generates a new random spacing of delays, with the current random seed being saved in your presets. This mostly matters for very low density settings, where you can actually hear individual reflections. For higher settings, it's practically irrelevant. On the next page, we then get to control the brightness of our tail. You can think of this as a kind of EQ automation over our reverb tail, with a low pass and a high pass filter with a traditional frequency control and a continuous pole count that sets filter steepness. One pole means 6 dB per octave, 2 poles 12, and so on. Using these, we can draw a damping shape and control the overall low frequency content. We then also get 2 optional bell filters, with a gain amount and a bandwidth that lets us add additional detail in our reverb envelope, making our room swallow a certain frequency range or gain a resonance. You can see that the visualizer changes as we set these. It's more or less a spectrogram of our reverb tail, I suppose. With other reverbs, you are at most able to create a filter like damping or like ProQ's reverb length curve, whose intensity increases over time as the reverb repeats its feedback loop, but being able to independently control the tail's profile at different points in time really is something very unique. It's especially cool for those more interested in what sounds cool and interesting, rather than about what would strictly be realistic, because it allows for a lot of sound design. Let's hear some different tail configurations so you can get a sense for how this works. Moving on to the next tab. In the effects section, we are presented with 3 different tools for further processing the tails that once again can be independently controlled for different stages of the reverb. This is really something special. With traditional reverb, once again, this is virtually impossible. The chorus does what you'd expect any chorus to do. It adds movement and some pitch variation to our sound. You can push it quite far for creative effects, but for traditional reverb, subtle settings tend to sound best. The phase distortion is mostly useful to decorrelate the reverb tail further from the dry signal. It basically just makes it sound noisier, which can for example be useful if you want the reverb to reflect the tonality of your dry signal less. Often a useful option to have when mixing. Lastly, the saturation saturates, as saturators tend to. I often like to saturate the input on my reverb sense a bit, because it just sounds nice, and having controls for different parts of the tail is of course very welcome. All these effects can be applied to a selected frequency range only as well, set by the low and high parameters, once again automatable over time. The stereo section is very important for getting believable results in my experience. You can decide whether the width of the lows increases or decreases over time, and if there are any panning fluctuations. I often draw a little zigzag in here just to give the impression of a real space that's not perfectly symmetrical. Now before we move on to the dynamics post-processing section, let's maybe take a closer look at the envelope editor. This is really the core of this plugin, drawing all these envelopes for shaping the tail, so it pays off to spend some more time on it. First of all, something you may have been wondering about, changing the reverb tile will simply stretch or squash any envelopes we have. They're all relative. If you want to lengthen or shorten the tail, but keep the same timing on your FX envelopes, you can move around the last point of the gain envelope instead. This will leave all other envelopes alone. If we set our time to a note value instead of seconds, we get to snap to a beat grid by clicking this little magnet icon here. This is pretty useful when we want to create rhythmic effects. I'll play you some examples in a bit. If we hit Q on not quantized breakpoint, it will also be snapped to the grid. Lastly, there are two types of vertices for our envelope. By double clicking we create a breakpoint. By single clicking and dragging we create a bend. If we right click a breakpoint or bend, we can crossfade between the two for more or less smooth manipulation. Let's leave the envelope behind now and talk about the post-processing. We get two tools that can help us make our reverb get out of the way of the dry signal. The transient reset is maybe the more interesting one. If enabled, it will reset the reverb whenever it detects a transient, so nothing from before the transient will continue to ring out. You can also manually automate this reset button here. On the right we have a ducker, your standard way of sidechain compressing the reverb out of the way of the input signal. The pre-delay, dry and wet gain should be pretty self-explanatory. The dry gain comes with a lock icon to keep it constant as you cycle through presets. Apropos of presets, this is maybe the main thing this plugin is lacking. Because of its deep controls, it can take a few minutes to set up a nice reverb sound, so a few more presets you can quickly cycle through to pick something nice to tweak would probably be good. As is, the presets are mostly focused on more creative effects you can achieve, while the traditional reverb options aren't all that diverse. So, because to me the lack of presets is this reverb's main deficiency, I made some myself. You can get them for €1 on my Gumroad, and I'm also just going to be using these myself. I've been meaning to do this for a while. This video was a good excuse to finally get to work. I'm going to shut up for now and just play you the presets from said pack, so you can get a sense for some sounds you can get out of this reverb. I'll always play the dry sound first and then the preset. those should be enough examples for now. The pack in total contains about 15 of these. Some more creative, but I really try to focus on reverbs that are mostly just useful as reverbs. So yeah, that's this video. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.